Thank you, Chris. If you look in your bulletin, it says that I'm going to be preaching out of the Gospel of Matthew tonight. Well, that's just a joke. I'm going to be preaching from somewhere else. And the reason is I didn't finish my sermon this morning, and I would like to. And so if you were here this morning, you know that we were in Nehemiah chapter 2. I invite you to turn there with me. I had a couple of our church members who approached me after the service and said, "You left me hanging this morning." And in some ways, that's a good thing. I've heard preaching professors say, always leave them wanting more, rather than wishing you had stopped sooner. So hopefully that proved true this morning. We're in Nehemiah chapter 2, and I want to finish some thoughts that we started there this morning. Our sermon was how to be a Christian in the real world. How to be a person of faith, not just in church, not just around people that believe like you or think like you or dress like you and talk and act like you, but how to be a Christian out there in the real world, right? Because when God gave us life here on planet Earth, He didn't intend for us to live in little monastic type communities like the monks of old did. He intended for us to be Christians on mission here in the world. I don't think that most of you, when you leave church on Sunday night, go home and hibernate for the next 6 days and then only wake up to come to church, right? No. But our spiritual lives shouldn't do that either, right? So we want to be Christians in the real world. And I want to share with you 3 things that you can do to be a Christian in that way, here in the real world. And they're things that we see modeled in the life of Nehemiah. He was a leader. He was an official in a pagan, foreign court, hauled off into captivity among God's people. And there he used his position and his influence to do good for God and for God's people. And that's the story into which we find ourselves tonight, right in the middle of Nehemiah 2. And our first point that we covered this morning was to serve God right where you are. That is, not to wait, not to serve God in your mind or your imagination. Never to say something like this: I'm going to serve God later. Or I'm going to serve God when things get lined up just right in my life. You know, as I was leaving the parking lot this morning, I got in my car, turned onto Cromartie Street, and it just struck me. You can only serve God right now. Like, you can't serve Him tomorrow. Not until tomorrow, right? Right now is the only time that you can actually serve God, right now. Now, tomorrow will be tomorrow's version of right now, of course, but you can't get credit for tomorrow before it gets here, so don't put it off. Don't say, I'll serve God when I have more time. Don't say, I'll be more faithful when I have more money. Don't say, when I heal from this tragedy, then I'll be more faithful. No, serve God right where you are. We saw that Nehemiah used his position or his job. We see he even used the difficulty and the heartbreak in his life to serve God. And we also see that he used his ambition. He had a dream, or we might would say a vision for what God wanted to help him to do, and he used all of that in large ways to serve God. And so that brings us to verse number 9. We're in Nehemiah 2, verse number 9, and to our second point, right where we left off this morning. So let me share with you, secondly, what we need to do in order to serve God here in the real world. Be prepared for difficulty and opposition. Be prepared for difficulty and opposition. Let me tell you something. This may be the most true thing that I say all night. Serving God is awesome. But it ain't easy. Serving God's awesome. It's wonderful. You can't do any better than to serve God. But it ain't easy. In fact, if anyone would lead you to believe otherwise, I would say that person is either misinformed, maybe they're just ignorant, maybe they're deceived, or maybe they're being dishonest. Because when you sign up to be a Christian, when you sign up to serve God, nowhere in God's Word, nor in the experience of any true Christian, will you find it true that all your problems just miraculously go away. Now, some people say that. Have you ever heard TV preachers or something like that? It's commonly referred to as prosperity theology, or prosperity gospel. That is, just give it to God and everything will be fine. If you just have enough faith, God will fix all your problems. You know what I call that? Besides calling it heresy, I call it hogwash. And that's a nice way of putting it. Really. That's not the message of the Bible. Tell that to Jesus while he's hanging on a cross. Jesus, where was your faith? No, that doesn't work. So, be prepared for difficulty and opposition. If you're going to serve God here in this life, you don't need to be naive. You don't need to pretend that real problems are somehow fake. You can admit that they are real and that they're hard. Be prepared for difficulty and opposition. Let's read in our passage, picking up in verse 9. We're going to read down to verse 16, and we're going to see as Nehemiah sets out to serve God in a real way, he immediately meets with difficulty. Verse 9 says, "Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and I gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite, his servant, heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel." I'm going to continue reading in just a moment. Let me point out we're 2 verses in to Nehemiah setting out to do what God's called him to do. He's just left the capital city where he was serving the king as cupbearer, and as soon as he leaves, you know what he meets with? Naysayers. Opposition. As soon as he leaves, he meets these knuckleheads, and they don't like it that he's setting out to repair the city of God. Verse number 11, it says, "So I went to Jerusalem, and I was there for 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me, only the one on which I rode. I went out by night, by the valley gate, to the dragon spring, and to the dung gate, and I inspected there the walls of Jerusalem. They were broken down. Its gates had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley, and I inspected the wall. I turned back, entered by the valley gate, and so returned." Verse 16. "And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work." This is a very interesting passage of Scripture to me. Nehemiah travels this great distance somewhere in the Assyrian Empire, and all the way back to the heart of the Middle East, to Jerusalem itself. And as he gets there, he rests for 3 days, and then he goes out in the middle of the night to survey the work to which God had called him, to look, to think, to be quiet, to in a manner of speaking, count the cost of the task that was before him. Now, I am reading between the lines a little here, but I do think that it's not far-fetched to imagine that as Nehemiah walked around this city, we know he was a man of prayer. I think he prayed as he walked around that city. He saw how big and how difficult and how just seemingly impossible the task was before him. He wasn't naive. He didn't pretend things would be easy. He looked at the task right in the eyes, and he surveyed the work that God had called him to in quiet, nearly all alone. And I think there he prayed and he committed his work to God. You know the very first thing that Nehemiah did? The very first thing he did in order to complete the task that God called him to was, in the ancient world, he traveled a distance of nearly 800 miles. That's how far it would have been from where he was serving the king in a foreign empire all the way back to Jerusalem. So I want you to think about that, right? Think about this just for a moment. Nehemiah is feeling great. He's serving God. He feels like God's call on his life is the clearest that it's ever been. He's going to serve God. And the first thing he does was probably really, really hard. I have never traveled 800 miles on horseback or by camel or however they did it. I don't imagine it was very easy. I don't imagine they had great amenities on that kind of a long-distance travel. It was the first thing he did. After he risked it all, laid his neck on the line in front of the king, God blessed him, had his hand upon him. He didn't go home and just feel good about himself. He got to work. And the work wasn't easy. He traveled a distance that was so far, our passage tells us in verse 11 that when they got to Jerusalem, he had to rest for 3 days. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think he was wore out. It was a long journey. All the participants and all the animals were probably worn out, somewhat malnourished, and probably were very thirsty. Many of them were probably sick from the long journey. Most historians estimate that a journey of this probably took at least 2 months, probably more 3 months. Now listen, it's easy to ride high on the wave of emotional experience for a day. It's even easy to ride high on that wave for a week. I mean, if God does something big in your heart and you see doors opening in front of you, doors that open out into what you really believe God has called you to, that feels good, doesn't it? I mean, it's easy to sleep at night when you feel in your heart that God's moving and that He's working. But you can't ride that wave for 2 or 3 months out in the desert. You got to be committed to something. You have to be driven more. You have to be driven by more than merely an emotional experience. You got to be driven by firm and deeply felt, strongly held convictions. And that's what I believe Nehemiah was driven by. He was barely started out on this long journey. And verse 10 says he met Sanballat and Tobiah, and they were displeased, our passage says in verse 10, that Nehemiah and his party was going to restore the walls. They weren't happy. They weren't happy. And we'll talk more about that opposition in just a moment. But I want to share this truth with you. And it's a good one. It's one that I think we need. Jesus does not want from you and me merely a blind emotional decision. He doesn't want us to get caught up in the heat of the moment and say, yes, Lord, whatever you want, just because our emotions drive us to do something like that. I'll tell you what Jesus wants from us. We see it modeled for us in the grit, the conviction, and determination of Nehemiah. He wants from us an intentional, maybe even somewhat nervous willingness to commit ourselves to a life of faithfulness no matter what it costs. That's what He wants. We cannot live our lives like a yo-yo that goes up and down based on emotional experiences. We've got to be committed. We have to be driven by something bigger and stronger than just emotional appeals. And we see that in Nehemiah. Nehemiah was committed. You don't do what he did based on emotional whims. You know, I'm reminded of some passages of Scripture, I think, that speak to this well. Jesus talked about discipleship. He talked about counting the cost of following Him. Jesus made no pretense before His potential followers. He never said, I'm just going to make them all happy, and then once they start following me and they realize it's not easy, I hope they'll stay. No, up front, Jesus explained for all the world to see and to hear, following me is not going to be easy. Here's what Jesus said. Luke 14, beginning in verse 28. Jesus said, which of you, desiring to build a great tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete the tower? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and he's not able to finish, all who see will begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build, and this man was not able to finish. Now, Jesus wasn't really talking about building a building. It was an analogy. He was making a point. You know what he was talking about? He was talking about people who, in the heat of the moment, when everyone else was doing it, when it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time, give an emotional response, and they say, all right, I'll serve Jesus. But then a few weeks later, they realize it's not always easy to serve Jesus. It is always great. It is always right. And I think most important, it is always true to serve Jesus. But it ain't always easy. It's not. It's not always easy. And Jesus wanted us to know that. Because He did not want a person who just jumped in line and said, all right, I'm going to follow you. And then when things got hard, they just wavered and fell on the wayside. That's not what Jesus was interested in. It reminds me of a passage that we actually read this morning. If you're here this morning, during the pastor's welcome time of our worship service in which we read Scripture together, I read from John chapter 6. And I read that passage very intentionally with this point from our Nehemiah sermon in mind. It was a passage in which Jesus had a lot of people following Him. Jesus was popular at this point in his ministry. If he had been the pastor of his church would have been the hot one in town at this juncture in the gospel stories, okay? John chapter 6, lots of people were following Jesus. And then he started sharing with all of those followers some very difficult truths, right? He didn't just give them what they wanted. He gave them the truth. And the passage there, it says in John 6, beginning in verse 66, after this, many of his disciples turned back, and they no longer walked with him. That's a sad verse, isn't it? The King of Kings, in the flesh, calling for followers. And even then, even in that great scenario, people got caught up in the moment. They said, I'll follow Jesus. He's doing all kind of great things. That's kind of what everybody's doing. And when things got difficult, people turned their backs on Jesus himself. Not just a church, not just a community, not just friends, not just people that they had sat with in a pew for years. On Jesus. They turned their backs and they went away. And so Jesus said to the 12, and I can just picture this so clearly in my mind's eye. Jesus looking there at people like Peter, people like John, people that we know from these gospel stories. And he said, do you guys want to leave too? And I think that's a question that all of us, we need to face and we need to come to terms with. Is the commitment that we have to Jesus something that's real and something that's lasting and something that can stand fast even in difficult times, or is it just something we do just to have something to do? We need a firm, a lasting commitment to Jesus. Let me tell you, both the tasks that God calls you to and the people that God calls you to serve will probably be difficult. Do it anyways. Do it anyways. You know what I'm learning? I'm not a very aged man, but listen, when God blesses me and teaches me something, I'm listening. What I'm learning in life is that most things that are worthwhile are hard. You know, I think the greatest gifts that I have on this earth are my wife and my kids. But you know, it's not always easy being married and having kids. Yeah, I mean, just this afternoon, my sweet little Delaney, she was so impressed that I had bought a box of Fruity Pebbles. And that box was bright, and those things are good. I mean, I still enjoy a bowl of Fruity Pebbles. And we just thought it was so cute. She thought they were all colorful. And guess what that sweet girl did? She grabbed the whole bowl and yanked it in the floor. Yes, they do. And they add up, and one after the other. And when you've had a long day and when you hadn't slept well. And I just say that to say that the things that are worthwhile in this life, they're not easy, right? And so if your life is all about making things easy, you lead a shallow life. Because depth will lead to difficulty. And our faith truly is a deep faith. The tasks that God calls us to, like Nehemiah, right? He was called to go back to Jerusalem. He was called to repair the wall. It was not an easy task. I mean, this wasn't just, you know, a weekend warrior do-it-yourself project on Saturday, okay? This was a big thing. His whole life had to change in order for this to happen. And he had to get a lot of other people on board with him in order to see this vision through. That task was hard. The people that he was called to work with were also often very difficult to work with. And the same is true in our lives. If you're serving God, the things he calls you to will sometimes seem impossible. And that's good, because that's right where God likes to meet you and say something like this: with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. That sound familiar? That was Jesus who said that. And he said it numerous times as he encountered persons like us struggling to believe well here in the real world. Let me share with you thirdly, our third and final point in what's become a two-part sermon here. What can we do to serve God in the real world? Take people with you. on your spiritual journey. You can expect that your life of faith will be difficult and that you will meet with opposition, but as we read the rest of this chapter, what you'll learn Nehemiah did was he didn't go alone. He didn't try to serve God all by himself. He strove really intentionally to take people with him on the spiritual journey that God had called him to. Look at verse 17. We'll read verse 17 down to the end of the chapter. I'll show you what I mean. So you remember, right before we go into verse 17, Nehemiah has finally made it to Jerusalem. He's walked all the way around the city's walls with all of its gates, and he's inspected it. And our passage made a point of letting us know he didn't tell anybody. Like all the people that he was going to hope would get on board with what he was trying to do, he hadn't told anybody yet. This was his vision. God had laid it on his heart. So that's where we're at when we get to verse 17. Verse 17, he says, "And then I said to them, you see the trouble that we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And so they said," so the people respond, "let us rise up and build." And so they strengthened their hands for the good work. We'll stop reading there, and we'll pick up in verse 19 in just a moment. Nehemiah goes public with the vision. He goes public with the dream. The thing that God had called him to, he lets people in on it. And the initial response is good. They say, yes, let's rise up and build. They strengthen their hands for the good work. And look at verse 19. "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us, and they despised us, and they said, 'What is this thing that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?' And then I replied to them," this is Nehemiah speaking, verse 20, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and we will build. But you have no portion. You have no right or no claim here in Jerusalem." And so these same knuckleheads that Nehemiah met when he started out on his journey, it appears that in some capacity they followed him to Jerusalem. And there, in what so far has been one of Nehemiah's finest moments, certainly in a public sense, his finest moment, he shared the vision. He's risked it all in front of the king. He's gone on this great arduous journey of 2 to 3 months through the desert, back to his homeland. He gets there. He surveys all the hard work, all of the labor, all of the difficulty that will need to be taken, that will need to be undertaken in order to repair the walls of this city. And now he rouses the troops, so to speak, and he shares the vision, and the people buy in, and they're excited. And what's the first thing that happens? Them knuckleheads. I don't know what else to call them. I'm searching for euphemisms, nice ways to say not nice things. And that Tobiah and Sanballat, and then adds another fella in here, Geshem the Arab. They made fun of him. They derided him. They cited the political authority of the king and said, "Who are you to do this?" And they're just naysayers. They were negative. And negative people can be very difficult. Little things that are said in a negative spirit can land with big force. Even on strong people. They can. And that's precisely what happens. He goes public with his vision, and he shares his vision with others. And there's a really, really special truth, I think, contained in the fact that Nehemiah didn't want to do this on his own. You cannot serve God by yourself. You can't serve God on your own. You cannot and you will not ever be the faithful Christian man or woman that God has called you to be if you try to do it in isolation. You can't do it. And yet many of us try, don't we? Many of us do, but you can't do it. You need a community of faith. We need each other. What does Nehemiah do? How does Nehemiah try to include others on this great spiritual journey? Let me just make a couple of observations about what he does, what he says, how he invites other people. All right, here's what God's called me to do. I would like for you to come along with me. You can imagine, okay? You can imagine that the folks who were still there in Jerusalem, if you want to call them a remnant, the folks who were there who hadn't been off in captivity, somehow they had escaped or they had been left to be. So they were there, living their lives in ruins. And a leader shows up. Nehemiah shows up. Can't you imagine that was exciting for many of them? I mean, really, they think, yes, we can do this. I've been wanting to do this. I'm so thankful that Nehemiah has come, and here he shared this vision with us. And so let me make a few observations about what he says, how he says it, and most importantly, how he goes about inviting other people on the spiritual journey with him. Number one, he was honest with them about how much work needed to be done. He was honest. Nehemiah didn't say, things are great when things were bad. He was honest. He was forthright. He said, listen, folks, the city's in bad shape, and we've got some work to do. He was honest with them. Secondly, he called the people to action. Notice in verse 17, after he said, you see how much trouble we're in, he said, come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem. He didn't leave people where they were. He didn't simply want to get them stirred up emotionally. He didn't want to just gather a crowd. He wanted these folks to help him, to work, to act on their faith. In verse 18, we learn a third thing. This is a great one. I mean, a good one about inviting other people into your spiritual journey. Nehemiah was an encourager. He was an encourager. Look at verse 18. In verse 18, he says, I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. And so the way that he led, the way he shared his vision, encouraged the people. It didn't beat them down. He didn't walk into Jerusalem and say, what's the matter with you folks? Why are the walls still in ruins? I mean, our people are hauled off into captivity, fighting for their lives. What have y'all been doing? Now, he could have said that, but that's not what he said. He said, God's hand is upon me. He has blessed me. He has put this work into my heart. He will help us do this, and I want you to be a part of it. And they said, yes, we'll be a part of that. That's good. That's leadership by way of encouragement. Here's another thing that he did. Another thing that he did as he invited people on the spiritual journey with him, he made sure that when he led people, he led them to build God's kingdom, not his own kingdom. That's important. That's important. He didn't say, I'd like to be a political leader and I need your help. He didn't say, I want to be known as the guy who came back to Jerusalem and rebuilt the walls. He said, this is a work God has called me to do. We want the city of God to be a place of witness and a place of worship to the one true God for all the world to see. And he brought these people along with him. Another thing that he did, and this is the final one that I'll share with you. He stood against opposition by standing upon the word of God. He stood against opposition not just by being defiant, not just by being bold or a strong personality. He stood against opposition by standing upon the word of God. That's what he did. Look at verse 19 and verse 20, and here we see that opposition. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab, when they heard of it, they jeered at us and they despised us, and they said, what's this thing that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And notice what he said in reply, verse 20. I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper. We are his servants, and we will arise and we will build. You have no portion or right or claim here in Jerusalem. Let me tell you something. People don't like change, do they? I don't. I'll be honest with you. I'm not real keen on change. Do you know every Sunday when I come to church, I wear the same shirt? I've got like 10 of them, but they're all the exact same. I don't like change. I find a shirt that fits, I stick with it. Don't give me a different shirt. In fact, when Christmas is coming up, and if a relative of mine buys me a white dress shirt, I'm going to have to put on a good face and say thank you. But on the inside, I'm going to be thinking that's not the shirt I wear. They're not expensive. They're just the one that I want, okay? People don't like change. And let me speak to that just a moment, because I think that's a large part of what the problem was for the opposition here against Nehemiah. These folks had grown very comfortable and very used to Jerusalem being the way that it was. And they didn't want some person coming in there and changing that. I want to talk about that just for a moment. This is our last point we'll make today. Change, in and of itself, is not virtuous. I mean, just to change something doesn't make it better automatically. But neither does staying the same. Right? I mean, you got to look at the thing and see if it's good. See if it's what it ought to be. It doesn't matter if it needs to be changed or if it needs to stay the same. Change in and of itself is not necessarily always virtuous, but neither is staying the same. Listen, people don't like it when you challenge the status quo. They just don't. There have been times where I've been watching our kids. Lauren was at work or something like that, and I was just watching the kids. And, when I'm watching the kids, I have one thing, one goal. My goal is not to cook a good meal for them. My goal is not to keep the house clean. I have one goal: keep the children alive. Like, that's the goal. Don't let them get big boo-boos while mama's not home. Like, that's the goal. And so I'm watching them. And so as I'm watching the kids, there have been times where my mother-in-law came over, or my mother have come over. And they come in, and I'm telling on myself here, y'all, and I'm just being transparent with you, but I've just got a good setup. The kids are playing. I'm sitting in the chair. I kind of got everything under control, but the room's a mess, right? So, I mean, I could be standing up and cleaning some, right? But I'm not. And I've just kind of grown comfortable with that. And then you know what my mom or my mother-in-law do sometimes when they come in? Yeah, they walk in, they start picking up bowling pins and baby dolls, and I'm sitting in my chair, oh, great, now I got to get up. And they're like, no, I'll clean it. And I'm like, well, I can't just sit here while you're cleaning. You're challenging the status quo. I've grown comfortable with the way things are. We've got a nice little system here. Don't come in all excited and ready to work and mess me up. And that's sort of what Nehemiah did. I say it's sort of, that's really exactly what he did. Jerusalem was a mess, and everybody had just learned to live with it. And Nehemiah had a call on his life, and the call was right into the middle of that mess to help those people start cleaning it up. And when he got there, there were a few folks that were like, listen, Nehemiah, gee whiz, buddy. I mean, just come in here riding on your high horse, telling us the city's in shambles. Where have you been for the last 100 years? We've been here trying to make a life in the midst of ruins. And here you come in making everybody feel uncomfortable, trying to make things change. And they opposed him. And listen, they didn't just oppose him by talking about it. Things got serious. And we'll see as we study the book of Nehemiah a little bit more, these folks weren't just aggravated with Nehemiah. Eventually, they wanted to kill the man. So, I mean, this was serious. He challenged their status quo. People don't like it when you do that. People don't like it when they feel their power or when they feel their influence start slipping away. You can imagine that these characters, Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, you can imagine that they were probably some sort of leaders, perhaps tribal leaders in the suburbs of ancient Jerusalem, so to speak, the little outlying communities. And they wielded power. There was no centralized government in place in Jerusalem. They didn't want Jerusalem to start being rebuilt. They were going to lose their power. And you can imagine that they were tempted to think, who is this Nehemiah guy anyways? Who does he think he is? He can just come in here and start changing things. And, I find great encouragement in the story of Nehemiah because anybody, anywhere you try to serve God, anywhere, in your family, in your workplace, in the parking lot, at the grocery store, it doesn't really matter. Anywhere you go, if you serve God, you're going to run into people who are living the status quo, and your attitude of just go get them and be faithful and work hard for Jesus is going to make them feel uncomfortable, right? Because you're challenging their status quo. And Nehemiah is a great encouragement to me for the way that he led and the way that he invited others to come along with him. I can picture him, the awesome leader he must have been, surveying the city of God deep in the dark of night, riding around. He wasn't in it for prestige. He wasn't in it for glamour. He wasn't in it for compliments. He was in it because God called him to it. And he saw it was going to be hard work. And he rallied the people of God to get in on that work with him. He invited them in to his spiritual journey. And in that sense, we might say he discipled them. That's what we mean when we say we're to make disciples the way that Jesus told us to. It means you invite people to join you on your spiritual journey. You know who the greatest disciplers in my life have been? There were two. I'm going to tell you about them just for a moment. My greatest disciplers, I'm very blessed to be able to tell you this, were my parents. It was my mom and dad. And I thought they were actually going to be here tonight, and so I thought this part of the sermon might be a little awkward. But it turns out they're not, so it's a little easier for me. My mom and dad are not perfect, okay? But they are pretty awesome. And they taught me how to serve God. Here's how they did it. They served God. That's what they did. They served God. And when little baby Deke came along, they said, you can serve God with us. They just invited me on that journey. When the Lord's Day rolled around, they went to church. They didn't do it for me. They did it because they thought it was right. But I was part of the crew, so I went along. They were and continue to be great disciple makers in my life. They lived the Christian life, and they took me along for the ride. And I'm going to tell you something. They taught me in unmistakable ways how to be a Christian. That's what they did. That's what disciple making is all about. Letting people in your life, inviting them to take that spiritual journey with you. And that's what my mom and dad did. Not just at church, but in the real world. Right? In the real world. There's scenes in my mind that are very, very special to me. So, for instance, I remember on Sunday mornings, before church, always on the kitchen bar, it had a dark red tile on the kitchen bar. There would be a check that my mom had written out and left laying there for my dad. He left before her because he drove a bus to go pick up kids on Sunday mornings. He would grab the check, put in his Bible. You know what the check was? It was a tithe. I didn't know what tithing was when I was a little boy, but I knew my mom and dad put their money where their mouth was. They just believed you give to support the work of God, the mission of God. Do you know we had missionary families that my parents invited into our home? When they would come to our church to give reports, or when they would come home on furlough, Mom and Dad would sign up to host them in our house, and they would come to our house, and I remember hearing stories about people sharing Jesus all the way across the world. That made a mark on me. Can't you imagine? That made a mark on me. My mom and dad taught me how to serve God in the church. I remember being a little boy. My mom was the assistant director for the children's church program. And so my mom would get up there with puppets and do puppets and run off copies of coloring sheets and things like that. My dad was always a Sunday school teacher. He taught middle schoolers. He taught elementary schoolers. He's taught men's classes. He's always done that. For years on years, every Sunday morning, I would go and I'd help my dad make all the coffee for the adult Sunday school classes. And we thank God for that wonderful drink. Coffee. Little things like that add up, right? My dad didn't have to tell me, Deke, when you grow up, you should serve God. You know what he had? You know what he did? He just served God. And he invited me along for the ride. And by God's grace, I'm a Christian man today. And one of the things that God used more than anything else was a faithful mom and dad. And I want to tell you, whether your kids are still at home, or whether your kids are grown, or whether you have grandkids, you know as well as I do, you can be that for them. You can invite them on your spiritual journey. And you don't do it by condescending them or just getting on to them, just telling them all the things they do that are wrong. You do it by inviting them into your life and just letting them be part of you as you serve God. That's what it means to invite people on your spiritual journey. That's what Nehemiah did. That's where chapter 2 ends. Lord willing, we'll pick up with chapter 3 when we meet again. But what I'd like to do tonight is give you a time of invitation, because I think this is an important message. I think it's an important message for us as Christians to remember we've been called to serve God, not just in a pew, but in the real world, right? In the real world. It's not always easy, but it is always worth it. And so during our time of invitation tonight, my call to you is to commit yourself in a new way to God, to serve Him. You know when it starts? It starts the moment we leave this place. As we leave, as you get into your car, you may be tempted to get in an argument with somebody. Let me tell you, serve God in the middle of that argument. Probably means being quiet or saying you're sorry. As you get home and you have the option of being a good roommate to your spouse or to your children, or being a bad one, let me tell you, serve God there. When you wake up tomorrow and you go to your place of employment, or you go to your place in town or to your friend's house, serve God there. I tell you, that's where it counts most. I mean, church is important, but it's not that hard to play church, y'all. You know that. You've had bad Sundays, and you just dialed it up a little bit and pretended. It's not that hard. But God called us to live it out there in the real world. So let me invite you to commit yourself to do that tonight. Will you bow your heads with me as we have a time of invitation?